Hello, hello everyone. Welcome back to my channel. I have quite the tutorial for you guys today. This one basically makes like a ruffle. I've done it a few times myself and found a ton of tips that I want to share with you in order to make this one look correct. So, first things first, let's talk about the basics. Start with a circle in the center or just a point in the center, and then you're going to draw a wiggly line all the way around the edges. Now, when we draw this wiggly line, you want to pinch your line in to where it collapses on itself. So when you're drawing a wiggly line, you think of like this, but we want it to actually go more like that, where it cuts in, and then the same thing over here, we want it to go out. So a bubble, a bubble, a bubble, a bubble. Now, the other thing about when you're drawing your wavy line is any time that you have a bubble that goes more extreme like that, it's going to look really lovely because what's going to happen is it's going to cut in on itself and it's going to look more dramatic. So when it's going extreme on one side, that's a good thing. So that's the first tip. The second tip is when you're going around the outside edges, you have two different ways to do this. So we do a dot in the middle, a wiggly line on the edges, and then we're going to go around and we're going to draw a ridge to our ruffle. And I like to draw a ridge on the highs and the lows and kind of pinch in right on the extremes of the vectors. And then we can go down to the dot. But another way you could do this, where you would go pinching in right here, I'd pinch right at this edge. I could go all the way down to the dot instead. And then sometimes I like to start in the middle of my curl so I can kind of figure it out. So here's where I would pinch it in. I'm going to take it down to the dot. Same here's where I would pinch it in. I'm just going to take it down to the dot. So what that creates is where this kind of folds into itself a little bit, which is kind of lovely. Making sense? Not quite yet. Let's draw a full page so you can see what's going on. So I'm going to start with a small center point, a dot or a circle, and then I'm going to draw a wavy line around in a circle, a bigger circle around this dot. So that's going to be my ruffle's edge is going to be a circle, but it's going to be a wavy line, and the way we want the wavy line to work is that we want it to kind of bubble at the bottom and bubble at the top, so it pinches in on itself. And they don't have to be equal waves. It's perfectly okay for them to be different every time, but we want to try and add in where it bubbles out and it bubbles out, so it has kind of a pinch in with itself. We've got our circle. It's not super uniform, and that's okay. Now I need a clear ruler of some sort. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to draw from the point to the outermost points on this bubble. So the inner bubbles I'm going to connect to the dot, and the outer bubbles I'm going to leave alone for now. So see how that's the outermost point of this wave, and then this would be the outermost on this one. And I messed up a little bit, so I'm going to scoot it over. Now I have found you want to go a little bit on the extreme side on the flaring outlines of the inner circles. The outer circles, we want them to get kind of pinched as second best. Now I would say this is the outermost point of this circle, but when I'm connecting to this dot, it doesn't want to do that. So what I can do is just let that cross over like that, and we can add a line later for this outside edge. Anytime you have a bunch of lines that collect together and then flare out, it's going to look really dramatic when all those lines pinch close together. So I find this one to be just a lovely look. It reminds me a lot of the chiaroscuro paintings with the extreme radiating light. So, inner ones have a wave, have a line connecting to the center. The outer ones have been left blank. Now these outer ones, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a negative space that goes all the way to the center. So I'm going to try and make it pretty uniform all the way around the shape and then bring it into the center. Now this is going to be colored in solid, and I used my thickest brush calligraphy pen and it still was not great enough. So I think I am going to move on to using paint to fill it in because the spaces are so large that I don't really like the brush strokes that were left behind. I feel like I am just completely emptying my ink pen and I'm going to need a whole new pen. So now these are all going to get filled in with a solid color. And then these, I'm going to keep doing lines to fill out the space. This is where you're going to want, ideally, some sort of see-through ruler. If you don't have a see-through ruler, look for a piece of plastic that's got a nice straight edge and just use that. I feel like these lines are so precise into the center, it really helps to be able to see where you are drawing. Now, if we're going to get technical, the most ideal would be to be lines closer together in the edges and then they space out more in the center, but I'm not going to overthink it. I'm just going to make it happen and enjoy the ride. Now here's where the real magic is that pulls everything together. This outermost point on the upper levels, we want to connect to the center. Now it doesn't actually have to connect to the center, but we want it to visually look like it meant to. And if you want, you can add a little bit of a curve to it so it doesn't look so it looks a little bit more organic like that. And this is going to be a solid dark color. This is where I would grab like a brush pen and I can fill it in nicely, but I have to be real careful on these points that I get them precise. And this is what really makes the whole thing visually make sense, is this part is the magic. Now this is like what I was talking about with the ruffle that goes more extreme in. I feel like that really pulls it together quite a bit. It adds an interesting element that your eye didn't expect. And sometimes I can't quite figure out what is going on. Like I have a wish for something to be here, but visually I don't see it. So I take my ruler to see. It really doesn't need a little flare out over there. I want it to, but it doesn't make sense. Okay, so there's my first ruffle, and I can choose to color these in if I want to, or I can leave them blank, or I could even add a color if I want to. But you can see on this one, this is what it would look like if I added the color, and this is what it looks like if I leave it blank. It's two very valid ways of making it happen. Now, like I was talking about before, when making this ruffle on this edge, you can pinch it in on the edges and it'll look more like this, or you can keep it to where you're drawing these shapes so that it's got this nice solid edge to the foldable above it. Both ways I like. I like this one a little bit better in some incidences. I kind of like to mix the two together. See how this has a tight ribbon at the top and the bottom? So I flare out, and pinch on the extreme spots. There's quite a bit of ways you can play with this pattern. So now I'm going to add another ruffle. I'm going to leave these white for now. I think I want to use a paint instead of a marker to fill those in. So I'm going to leave them airy and white, and maybe I'll prefer them colored in later. But right now we're just going to keep adding more ruffles. Has a bubble out, pulls it in with a bubble in. Bubble out, pull it in, bubble in. I could do a full circle all the way around, but I like it better when it is multiple layers, kind of like a rose collapsing in on itself. So same as last time, the outside edge is my fold over and the loops on the inside edge is the sticking out area. But I'm going to make this rim like I was talking about where it flares out, pinches at the extreme spot, and then flares in. Flares out, pinch to the extreme, flare in, flare out, and then it pinches in, and we got another meeting spot, and that's okay. All right, so this is going to be just a subtle difference, and you can decide which one you like better. I'm going to use the same point as my reference point for my lines. On this one, I would have preferred it maybe to pinch here. We're drawing our lines at the extreme points. A ruler keeps me honest with my angles. Okay, go ahead and add my lines while I'm here. And I'm trying to keep my thumb pressure heavier than my longer fingers, and I'm pushing this part in a circle and trying to keep this relatively in the center. It doesn't have to be perfect. I don't want to spend all day trying to make this precisely correct. Now see, this line and this line are going to meet. And one thing we might want to do is we might want to create a little gap right there. That way they don't cross over each other. Just a little containing wall. I found the same thing with the dark spaces. When the dark spaces are right up against each other, it's best to leave a little white streak to tell the different spaces. Now I have found when you're making these things that as long as your craftsmanship is good most of the time, the eye wants to make it make sense. So you don't have to cry when you make a mistake. Your eye just kind of fixes it. So we don't want to get too locked up into mechanical. We are a human being drawing this, and that is part of the beauty of hand drawing things as opposed to a computer, is because we, see how I'm adding a little bit of a space here just like I did there, we can change the rules. A computer won't change the rules. I think as time goes on, more and more the flaws are going to be seen as very beautiful in a drawing because the flaws are proof that a human made it, not a computer. Okay, so there's my second ruffle, and then I can keep going adding more and more ruffles. Bubble, bubble. We want it to pinch in just a little bit. I'm going to do it the same way as this one, where it flares out, and then it pinches at the extreme, and then flares in. Oh my goodness, I was thinking that the last one was lacking something. We forgot to do the outside edges. I thought it looks nice, but something feels like it's missing. This one is missing the drop downs from the outside edge, the solid black parts. This is the most important part of the entire thing, in my opinion, is this outside shadow. So you can see how this makes it really pop. That's the most important part. This is going to be another where it needs a little retaining wall so they don't run into each other, just like that. And that's not totally necessary, but ideally if we're going to have them collapse into each other, then the line that it is running into would be thicker. That right now I'm using the same pen for all edges, and so I don't have that in my favor, so that's why I like a little gap of space to help you differentiate the two spaces. Okay, now we're going to do that outside edge again. Outermost points, drawing a line in. Filling in those solid spaces, taking care to be as accurate as I can because this is the part that really makes it sing. Now I am using a calligraphy brush pen, so it's got a big brush tip on the end, and it's intended for calligraphy, for making thick and thin lines all in the same part. And part of what I like about this pen is I have these sharp points at the ends, these really narrow spots, and if I had a round tipped felt tip marker, I would never be able to get that real crisp point. Now I'm going to keep adding more, because why not? This is just a teeny tiny panel. This one didn't bubble out like I typically prefer it to do. It didn't have the bubble on the top and the bottom where it cuts into each other nicely. Working on the inside areas first, finding the extremes. So see how this is like a nice gliding wiggle? It doesn't have the same fold over pattern that these bubbles do. The bubbles make a really nice dramatic fold of a ruffle. And I can push it a little bit, I can fabricate it, but it's just not as nice as having two bubbles, one on each side. If I have a really nice soft wave, there's not as many foldovers on the back edge, and the back edge is where it really sings, is having a foldover. So I'm trying to create one that's not mathematically sound, and I think visually you'll see it. It's not quite the same. That circle edge is real important. Now a lot of my edges on this one have gone off the page, and so at this point we are a storyteller. We are trying to decide what does it look like off the page. And we try to remain true to whatever story we come up with about the part that's not seen on the page. But you don't want it to end right on the edge of the page. It ends up looking really suffocated if it's trapped right on the edge. So that wave did not have a lot of space that I could add to it, so that was not very beneficial to the drawing. And you can see I can keep going on my page, but it's not going to look very good to have the whole page filled all the way to the edges. You see that? Having the nice clean white space is actually nicer, because we are getting to where what I focused on was adding more outward dips, and really the inward dip is where all the artwork is. We are getting closer to the edge. The additional marks are just making it harder to see what's happening. Alright guys, so there's the pattern. That's the basic look. What do you guys think? Do you think you would use this one? Thanks for watching.